So, over the past 2 weeks, we've been building up an answer to the assumed player question from the design side. Winner shows us that artifacts embody political assumptions. Buka showed us that those assumptions are the frozen traces of whose interests prevailed in the process of stabilisation. Bayliss from last week showed us that the interface at every layer, material, software and conceptual, is built from an imagined body with imagined competencies. Technicity, as Dovey and Kennedy describe it, is the accumulated capital that lets some players move through these interfaces like fish in water, while others find them opaque and exhausting. This week we move from the design side to the social side. We stop asking what the design assumes and start asking what actually happens when real people arrive. Who shows up? On what terms? Who gets welcomed? And who finds the space actively hostile? These are questions about access, about culture, and about ideology. And they reveal that the assumed player question is not only built into interfaces, it's enforced by communities, reproduced by industries, and embedded in the political commitments of the people who build virtual worlds. It might seem like a simple empirical question, who plays games? You count them. But when you start looking at the data, something more interesting emerges. The patterns you find cannot be explained by individual preferences or abilities. They have to be understood structurally, as the outcomes of larger cultural arrangements that determine who has access to these spaces, who is welcome when they arrive, and who is driven out. That is the thread running through all three of this week's readings: Yee, Drenton and colleagues, and Malaby. Each of them approaches social difference in virtual spaces from a different angle. And together they build a picture that should complicate any assumption that online gaming is either a level playing field or simply a reflection of offline society. It's neither. It's something more interesting. So Nick Yee's paper begins with a common claim that men and women are underrepresented differently in online spaces because they prefer different things. That women want cosy, social, nurturing gameplay, that men want competition and combat, and that this difference, if not innate, at least tracks some deep pattern in how men and women relate to play. Yee's response to this is empirical, and it's fairly decisive. Using survey data from over 40,000 MMO players across more than half a decade, he ran a factor analysis of player motivations. The analysis yielded 10 distinct motivations for play. These were achievement, socializing, discovery, mechanics, relationship, role-playing, competition, teamwork, customization, and escapism, and then compared how men and women scored on each. The result: an average overlap of 87% across all motivations. Men and women in MMOs want broadly the same things from their games. Even in the motivation with the largest gender gap, mechanics, meaning interests in numerical optimization and system mastery, the overlap between male and female players was 66%. There is not a distinctive female brain of gaming waiting to be discovered and designed for, because the differences you observe between male and female players are most attributable to other factors, most importantly age. Female players in MMOs skew older than male players, and once you control for age, many of the apparent gender differences in motivation shrink significantly. So if preferences are not the explanation for female underrepresentation, what is? Yee's answer is access. Not technical access, but social access. The routes through which people gain legitimate entry to these spaces. The data are striking. While only about 1% of male players were introduced to MMOs by a romantic partner, around 27% of female players were. About 2/3 of female gamers play alongside their romantic partner. Less than 1/5 of male gamers do. Female players are also twice as likely as male players to be co-located with someone else while playing. What this reveals is that, for many women, entry into online gaming is conditional on male legitimation. Their presence in the space is treated as natural only if it can be attributed to a male relationship. They were brought in by a boyfriend. They're playing alongside a husband. Their presence is vouched for. And even then, other players often assume they are not really female, that anyone claiming to be a woman must be misrepresenting themselves unless they can produce a male co-player as evidence. The twisted logic Yi identifies as this. The assumption that women do not inherently want to play games is so entrenched that when women do play, their presence has to be explained away. They are there because of a man. The result is that physical and social barriers to entry get systematically misread as evidence of lack of desire, which then reinforces the original assumption. It becomes self-fulfilling. And this matters for game design, because the dominant response to female underrepresentation has been to ask what women want and then design for it. But if access is the problem rather than preference, then you are designing solutions for the wrong question. Yi's paper focuses on player experience and motivation. Drenton and colleagues pull back to look at the broader cultural and structural context, the history of how gaming became coded as masculine in the first place, and why that coding has proven to be so durable. They trace a genealogy that begins in the arcade era, when games were public amusements associated with adolescent male sociality. Girls were present, but as spectators, watching boys play. When consoles moved the practice into the home, games entered a domestic space that is traditionally gendered as female, and yet in homes with mixed gender siblings, brothers took control of the gaming system, and parents reported buying consoles for sons over daughters more often. The technology arrived in a domestic space, but retained the gendering of the arcade. By the time the internet arrived, with its promise of democratization and anonymous self-construction, you might have expected things to change, and they did, somewhat. Female players have consistently made up around 40% or more of the US gaming population since 2008. The claim that games are for boys is empirically false by any meaningful headcount, yet the culture of gaming, particularly competitive online gaming, has retained its hostile orientation toward women, toward people of colour, and toward anyone whose identity challenges the implicit default of the straight white male gamer. The most visible expression of this in recent years was Gamergate, the 2014 harassment campaign that mobilised against women and minorities in gaming, ostensibly over ethics in game journalism, but in practice amounting to a coordinated effort to drive specific people out of the industry and out of gaming communities. Drenton and colleagues situate Gamergate not as an aberration but as an expression of what they call toxic techno-masculinity, an identity that has come to define gaming culture, and it sees any diversification of gaming as an existential threat to the space. The important theoretical move in Drenton's paper is the call to move from micro-level analysis to structural analysis. Much of the existing research on gender in gaming documents individual differences. This demographic plays more hours. That demographic is more achievement-oriented. Women experience harassment at higher rates. This is useful descriptive work, but it leaves unexplained why the structure looks the way it does. Drenton argues we need to look at the industry itself, at the fact that around 76% of game developers are white and the overwhelming majority are male. At how this demographic homogeneity in production shapes the assumptions baked into games, and at how the broader cultural context of misogyny in tech and in American public life bleeds into and is reinforced by gaming culture. This connects directly back to Winner and Bucher. The design of games is not neutral. Who is designing matters. What they assume their player looks like matters. The culture of the studios that make these games matters. And the stabilization of particular design conventions. What counts as a game? What kinds of play are valued? What bodies are assumed? Is a political process, even when no one is explicitly saying so. So Thomas Malaby's Making Virtual Worlds is an ethnography of Linden Lab, the company that built and ran Second Life. It is a different kind of text from the others this week. It's not primarily about who plays virtual worlds, but about who builds them, and what assumptions they bring to that work. Malaby spent time embedded at Linden Lab's offices in San Francisco, and what he found was a company deeply shaped by a particular ideological tradition, what he calls techno-liberalism. Rooted in the counterculture computing scene of the 60s and 70s, the Whole Earth catalogue and the open source software movement, the core dispositions is a combination of deep distrust of institutional authority, like hierarchies, governments and formal organizations, so a deep distrust of those, and a corresponding faith in technology as a kind of universal solvent, a force that, when placed in the hands of creative individuals, bypasses institutions and produces better outcomes. The mantra of this tradition is tools, not institutions. Give people the right tools and they will build what they need. The problem that institutions create, bureaucracy, politics, exclusion, are solvable by designing better platforms. What is striking about this, or what Malaby makes clear, is that this is itself a political position. It's not apolitical. The faith that technology can substitute for institutional governance, that markets of individual choices produce the best social outcomes, that hierarchies are problems to be engineered away, these are ideological commitments. They are, in fact, recognisably libertarian commitments, though their proponents often describe themselves as apolitical. And these commitments shape what Second Life becomes. Linden Lab designed a world in which users could build anything, trade anything, organise however they wanted, and deliberately withheld governance structures. When communities emerged that needed protection from harassment, when power asymmetries developed between wealthy users and new arrivals, and when the space began to develop all the social problems of any real human environment, Linden Lab's response was consistently to provide tools rather than rules. The assumption that the social would emerge from individual creators pursuing enlightened self-interest without institutional scaffolding was built into the architecture of the world. But the social did emerge, and not always in ways Linden Lab anticipated. Rosedale himself described being brought up short by the development of communities in Second Life that had a collective identity and wanted to include or exclude not as individual actors, but as participants in socio-political struggles. The techno-liberal model had no place for this. It imagined users as autonomous individual creators, not as people who form groups, establish hierarchies, who discriminate or harass and seek solidarity against one another. The lesson Malaby draws out is one that resonates with everything we've discussed the past 3 weeks. The people who build virtual worlds are not neutral technicians. They are people with politics embedded in a specific cultural tradition, designing spaces that encode these politics. The tools, not institutions philosophy, is not an absence of politics. It is a particular politics, and its effects on who can build a life in these spaces, who is protected and who is exposed, who has power and who is left without recourse, are real. So put these 3 readings alongside each other and you get a picture of social difference that operates at multiple levels simultaneously. And in doing so, they develop each of the 3 threads that we've been tracking. At a level of the individual player, Yi shows that the differences you see are not about innate preferences, but about access, about the gendered social routes through which people gain legitimate entry into gaming communities. The assumed player here is not only built into the interface, it is enforced by other players, by the community's expectations, and by the social logic of who is supposed to be there. At a level of gaming culture, Drenton and colleagues show that these access problems are structural, produced and reproduced by an industry that has historically centred a particular demographic, by marketing and design that encodes that centering, and by community cultures that actively police the boundaries. The magic circle, it turns out, has bouncers, and they have not been checking everyone's credentials equally. At a level of virtual world design, Malaby shows that the spaces themselves are not neutral containers but ideologically loaded environments, built by people with specific political commitments that shape what kinds of social life are possible within them. Linden Lab's tools not institutions philosophy is not apolitical. It encodes an assumed user, the autonomous individual creative who needs only the right tools to thrive and who will solve any problem that institutions might otherwise address. It is technoliberalism by design. All three connect to the boundary question. Yee's data shows that offline gender relations cross directly into online spaces. Drenton's analysis shows that a harassment campaign can extend well beyond the game, into journalism, employment, home addresses, while using the game as a staging ground. And Malaby shows that a virtual world's governance failures produce consequences that are entirely real for the people living in them. What these readings do not yet give us is a theoretical vocabulary for precisely how advantage accumulates and reproduces itself, why it proves so persistent, why it so often becomes invisible to those who benefit from it. That is what next week provides. Pierre Bourdieu's framework of capital, fields and habitus will let us name what we have been seeing, and it will reveal in the process why the assumed player so rarely recognises their own advantage as advantage rather than simply as the natural order of things.